Hello, and welcome to this analysis of Chapter 3 of Kate Constable's Crow Country. This is an interesting chapter in that it does focus very much on the relationship between Ellie and Sadie. So let's see what happens in this one. It opens up with Sadie returning home and she is confronted by her mother, and pretty much with the sort of response you would expect from, a worried mother here. And where did you disappear to? I don't want you running off without telling me where you were going. And they're the sorts of things that Sadie would have expected and almost alluded to in some of the previous chapters anyway. And then we can see that there's been tension for some time between these characters. Don't make me go through this again. You know we couldn't possibly afford a house this good in Melbourne. So it's almost as if they're treading over old ground here, and this has been a sore point in their relationship for some time. And we get that because they've been here for a month, and it's obvious that Sadie still hasn't come to the realization that her bitterness isn't going to change anything. And we've got this nice little description from Ellie here. It's a sweet little town. There's the lake, the birds, it's beautiful. Just give it a chance, for God's sake. It's almost in exasperation. You can see the tone that Ellie speaks in. She's tried to convince her daughter so many times and it hasn't worked, and she's essentially repeating the same message again and again. And I like that example because it's a little bit of foreshadowing. Because as we read on, we have to work out if this place is as sweet as what it appears to be. And what is the significance of the lake, and what are the birds and their significance to Sadie? And is it really this beautiful place that it's made out to be, or is there something hidden under that camouflage of the cute little town of Bort that needs to be unearthed? Let's keep going. This quotation here: suddenly Ellie performed one of the lightning about faces that so charmed other people and made Sadie furious. Ellie dived for her daughter, squeezed her tight and rained kisses on her ear. Sadie struggled to free herself. And it's a lovely description, if you like, of the affection of a mother trying to win back her daughter, and sort of showing that in spite of all their differences, in spite of all their conflict, there's still some genuine love there. And it's good to see that sort of relationship between the two characters, because up until this point it has been quite strained in many ways. So a typical Australian family, if you like. There's both joy, but there's some sadness mixed in. There's love, and there's difficulty. We've got that balance. And then there's the talk of the football. And as they walk to the football, they go past the RSL building, which is a iconic Australian institution, the Return Servicemen's League, and it shows the respect that we have for our war veterans, and it's a way of remembering that those very important times in our past, of the sacrifice that others have made so that we can have the freedoms that we experience today. And we'll look at that more closely as we go through, because that notion of sacrifice and what we celebrate is raised in later chapters. And the conversation between mother and daughter focuses on this idea. Did you know there are hazards on that war memorial outside the pub? Ellie laughed and linked armed with Sadie's. Of course, one of them's my grandfather. Serious? Clary Hazard, your great-grandfather. He was in the war. World War One. He fought in France. Did he get killed? No, he didn't. The memorial is for everyone who went to fight not just the ones who died. If he'd been killed, I never would have been born, and neither would you. No, he came back all right. He married Gran and had 4 kids and ran the shop across the road from the pub. That little corner shop. Sadie was slightly disappointed. It would have been a much better story if he'd been killed in the war. Now this war memorial will come up later in the text, and you have to remember some of these lines here that are spoken between these characters, particularly Ellie's lines when she reveals this idea that everyone who fought in the war, even if they returned, had their names put up on that memorial. And that notion becomes important later on. The reason I've got this section here in the pink is simply because it shows to a certain extent a little bit about Sadie's character here. She likes to live in the dramatic. She likes to, in typical teenager form, she likes the extremes of stories, but she doesn't really see the human element in what she's saying. It would have been a much better story if he'd been killed in the war. Well, no, it wouldn't. And we often have that disconnect until we understand the stories more fully. And Sadie's still naive, and quotations like that highlight her naivety. Let's go to the next page. Once they're at the football game, they're doing their best to appear to be normal and locals. And we've got these paragraphs here that I've highlighted as being significant. Sadie turned away to stare at the footballers. A young player in a black and white striped jumper leapt up into the air, his mop of fair hair flying, and pulled at the red ball out of the sky. Cheers erupted and car horns blared around the ground. A middle-aged couple in black and white scarves clapped and whistled wildly. "Carn the magpies," yelled the man. "Great mark, Lockie." And these passages are, again, quintessential Australian representations. We've got the excitement at the footy, and it's the AFL, of course. And as this is in the initial chapters of the text here, it serves as our introduction to one of the important characters, Lockie. And even his name is mentioned in the blurb, so we know that he's going to feature quite considerably. And he's established here as having a certain amount of sporting prowess, which in the context of this story, in the context of this town, would be considered very important. These country towns would celebrate these individuals and the group in terms of the footy club itself, and they would have an important role to play in the identity and the social structure, if you like, of such townships. And it's a great representation of Australian teenage males, that competition, that desire to be physical and all those sorts of elements. So a typical sort of teenage male character is presented there. Now this passage is quite a lengthy one, but I think it's important, so I'll read through it. The woman looked at Ellie up and down. She seemed frosted from head to toe, as if she'd been dusted in powdered ice, from her sculpted blonde hairdo to her chilly smile. "Oh, I remember you." "In the back," bawled the man, oblivious to everything but the game. "Are you blind, umpire?" "And you remember Craig, of course," said Amanda. "Oh," Ellie juggled her sausage, suddenly flustered. "I didn't recognise, without the hair. Hello, Craig." The man swung round. He was bull-necked and shaven-headed to disguise his baldness. He gripped Ellie's hand in his own square red one. Ellie hazarded, "Well, well, well. Heard you were back. Wondered when I'd run into you." Ellie laughed uneasily and tried to tug the hand away, but Craig wouldn't let go. She put the other arm around Sadie and pulled her close. "This is my daughter, Sadie. Sadie, this is an old friend of mine, Craig Mortlock, and Amanda. We got married." Amanda slid a possessive arm through Craig's and gave Ellie an icy smile. As if Mum would be interested in her fat old husband, thought Sadie. Now this exchange between these adults is an interesting one, and this quotation highlights how quickly people judge and how difficult it is for people to forget the past, because we can see here how something from Ellie's past is already determining how she is seen and how she is judged in this instance. Clearly there is some tension between Ellie and Amanda because of the previous relationship between Ellie and Craig Mortlock. And it's interesting that Sadie picks up on this, commenting as if Mum would be interested in her fat old husband, when that's exactly what happened in the past. The description of Amanda's icy smile is enough to highlight the tension between Ellie and Amanda. And one thing I find interesting is you would expect that sort of tension and that sort of conflict to develop between younger members of the township, between the teenagers, but it's the adults here that are represented as having these difficulties. There'll be more about that relationship and the causes of that underlying tension revealed later in the text. And as the dialogue unfolds and the story continues, we come back to something more familiar to Sadie. "Wah," came the voice from behind her. "You want that?" Sadie whirled around. A crow stood nearby, watching her with its head on one side. She thought it was a different crow. It seemed smaller and more ragged, less glossy than the first one, but it was hard to tell. "Wah," said the crow again, indicating the remains of the sausage. Now this passage here kind of blends the two worlds that Sadie operates in. There's the real world of the football game, and then she's sort of almost escaping that into this spirit world where she's wondering if she's going to have another experience, if you like, with this crow, the crow spirit that's trying to communicate with her. And we get into those two worlds, particularly the spirit world, in much more depth later in the text. And from this exchange, it's difficult to know whether Sadie simply hears the voices in her head, or if the crow does actually have a voice to speak with her. And that relationship will continue to develop throughout the text. But as confusing as it is for us as an audience, it's more confusing for someone like Sadie. And you've got to love the names given to some of these football clubs. The Redbacks, which, as you know, is quite a venomous or quite a dangerous Australian spider. And Australia is known for the number or the proportion of dangerous animals that it has indigenous to its landscape and to its place. And the last quotation I've highlighted is simply this one here. "There were Mortlocks on the memorial too," said Sadie. "Oh, the Mortlocks own half of Bort. They've got a huge property called Invergary. I suppose it belongs to Craig now." Invergary. So the dried up lake belonged to them. And this is an interesting concept about ownership and the land and connection and belonging, and again, a lot of those are going to be looked at in much more detail. And we're getting the general overview in these initial chapters. So as Sadie learns about this world, so are we. And those ideas will be explored in much more depth later on. But that idea of ownership and who belongs where and what belongs to whom is an interesting one. Well, I hope that's given you some insight into this chapter, and I look forward to seeing you for the remaining chapters.
This has been an ETV production brought to you by Prindiville Catholic College.